The winter of 1886 came early to Minnesota, and it came with teeth. By the second week of November, the temperature had plunged to 20 below zero, and the Crow Wing River had frozen solid from bank to bank. Not the thin, treacherous ice of early winter, but a thick blue slab that groaned and cracked in the night like a living thing settling into sleep. The ice meant no fishing. The early freeze meant the cattle drives from the south had been cut short, the stockyards half empty, the butcher's hooks growing bare. The people of Pike Falls, who had trusted in the endless bounty of the frontier, discovered that bounty had limits they had never bothered to imagine. Everett Kane's butcher shop, which had never known a shortage in 7 prosperous years, sold its last side of beef on November 19th. The pork followed 3 days later. By the 1st of December, Kane was selling scraps he would have fed to dogs in better times: gristle and bone, organ meat, the parts that respectable people did not eat, and charging prices that would have been criminal if desperation had not made them merely unfortunate. The logging camps upriver sent men to town seeking provisions and found nothing. The families of Pike Falls, who had entered November confident and fat, entered December lean and afraid. But 2 miles east of town, where the river bent around a rocky point and the current had carved out a deep pool that the big northern pike favored in summer, Karen Lindquist descended the ladder into her root cellar and surveyed her wealth. The shelves that lined the stone walls held 43 wooden barrels, each one packed tight with fish layered in salt. Pike and walleye, perch and whitefish, catfish and bass, over 800 pounds of river protein, preserved by a method as old as the fjords of her homeland. The fish did not care that the river was frozen. The fish did not care that the cattle had not come. The fish waited in their beds of salt, patient and imperishable, ready to sustain life through whatever darkness the winter delivered. Karen ran her hand along the nearest barrel, feeling the rough oak staves beneath her calloused palm. 800 pounds. 2 years of labor mocked every step of the way. Poison, they had called it. Death in a barrel. She wondered how long it would take before they came to beg for it. She had arrived in Pike Falls in the spring of 1884, a widow of 39 whose husband, Anders, had drowned the previous autumn when his fishing boat capsized in a squall on Lake Superior. They had been building a life in Duluth, Anders working the commercial fishing boats while Karen preserved and sold the catch. It was a good partnership. He knew the water, she knew the salt, and for 12 years it had sustained them. Then the lake had taken him, as the lake had taken so many, and Karen had found herself alone with a skill that had no market in a city full of fresh fish. She moved inland, following the rivers, seeking a place where her knowledge might have value. Pike Falls was a logging town on the Crow Wing River, surrounded by forests of white pine that seemed to stretch forever. The men who worked those forests were perpetually hungry, burning through calories at a rate that would have killed a sedentary man in a month. They ate beef and pork, bacon and salt pork, whatever the butcher could provide. Fish was for Catholics on Friday and poor people who could not afford meat. Karen saw opportunity where others saw only limitation. The Crow Wing River teemed with life. Northern pike grew to 20 pounds in its deep pools. Walleye schooled in the riffles. Channel catfish haunted the mud bottoms. And almost nobody fished it seriously, because the logging camps wanted beef, and beef was what Everett Kane provided. She filed a claim on 20 acres of riverfront land that included the deep pool and a rocky shelf where a cabin could be built above the spring floods. The claim cost her $9. The land agent, a thin man named Haskell, warned her that the property was prone to flooding and far from town. "Suit yourself, Mrs. Lindquist," he said, "but a woman alone out there, it's not safe, not practical. You'd do better to find a husband and let him worry about providing." "I had a husband," Karen replied. "He taught me to fish. I will provide for myself." Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the North Woods, the river valleys, or somewhere the ice forms just as thick, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the river freezes and the meat runs out. Karen built her operation over 2 years, working with the patience of a woman who understood that good fish required good preparation, and good preparation required good infrastructure. The cabin came first, a sturdy log structure with a fieldstone hearth, built with help from a crew of Ojibwe workers who knew the land better than any white settler, and who appreciated that Karen paid fairly and spoke to them as equals. They taught her where the fish ran thickest, which pools held pike in summer, and which held walleye in autumn. She paid for this knowledge with smoked fish and silver, and the exchange benefited both parties. The root cellar came next, dug deep into the hillside behind the cabin, stone-lined to keep out moisture and vermin, with a temperature that held steady at 38 degrees year-round. She installed heavy wooden shelving, built to bear the weight of the barrels she would fill. A chestnut mare named Birch, purchased from a farmer who was leaving the territory, hauled the stones and lumber and supplies. The fish house went up last, a small building at the water's edge where she could clean and process her catch immediately, before the flesh had time to spoil. She built a wooden rack for drying, a stone trough for bleeding, and a long table where she could work in all weather. The salt she purchased in bulk from a merchant in St. Paul, paying premium prices for the coarse sea salt that her mother had always insisted was superior to the mined variety. She bought it by the barrel, 50 pounds at a time, hauling it up river on Birch's sledge. The merchant thought her mad. Who needed that much salt? But he was happy to take her money. The fishing began in earnest in the summer of 1884. Karen rose before dawn each morning and worked the river until the light failed. She used methods learned from Anders and from her father before him. Set lines baited with cut bait, gill nets strung across the current, a casting rod for the sport fish that responded to lures. She caught more than she could eat in a week, then a month, then a year. She caught fish by the hundreds, then by the thousands, and she salted them. The method was ancient, older than memory, brought to the New World from the coasts of Scandinavia, where it had preserved the harvest of the sea for Vikings and their descendants for 1,000 years. The fish were gutted and cleaned within an hour of capture, split open and laid flat, then buried in coarse salt, a layer of salt, a layer of fish, another layer of salt, until the barrel was full. The salt drew out the moisture, replaced it with brine, transformed fresh flesh into something that would last for months without spoiling. Properly salted fish, stored in a cool cellar, could sustain life through the longest winter, providing protein and fat and sustenance when nothing fresh could be found. Karen filled her first barrel in July of 1884. She filled her 10th by September. By the time the river froze that first winter, she had 20 barrels in her cellar, over 300 pounds of preserved fish. She ate from those barrels all winter, varying her diet with potatoes from her root cellar and bread from flour she had stockpiled. When spring came, she examined the remaining fish and found them perfect. The flesh firm, the flavor clean, the preservation complete. Her method worked. She continued through 1885 and into 1886, expanding her operation, refining her technique. She experimented with different salt concentrations, different curing times, different combinations of fish. She developed a method for smoking some of the catch over alder wood, producing a delicacy that could be eaten without further cooking. She pressed fish livers for oil that burned clean in lamps and could be used for waterproofing leather. By the autumn of 1886, her cellar held 43 barrels, 817 pounds of salted fish by her careful accounting, enough to feed a family of 4 for 2 years, enough to feed a much larger group for a single desperate winter. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The people of Pike Falls had been watching Karen's operation with a mixture of curiosity and contempt from the beginning. A woman alone, fishing the river like a man, hauling barrels of salt like a merchant. It offended the natural order of things. But it was the salting itself that drew the most criticism. Everett Kane was the most vocal opponent. He was a thick-bodied man with a florid face and hands that were perpetually stained with blood, who had built his butcher shop into the most profitable business in Pike Falls by controlling the supply of meat to the logging camps. He charged what the market would bear, which was considerable, and he did not appreciate competition. "The Swedish woman is pickling fish in barrels," he announced at the saloon one evening, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Pickling them in salt, like a peasant from the old country. I've seen the operation. Barrels full of fish, sitting in brine for months on end." He paused for effect, allowing his audience to imagine the horror. Do you know what happens to fish left in brine for months? They rot. They putrefy. They develop poisons that no amount of cooking can destroy. The woman is stockpiling death in those barrels, and if anyone is fool enough to eat what she produces, they will learn exactly what I mean. The warning spread through Pike Falls with the speed of all small-town gossip. Poison fish, people called it. Scandinavian death brine. The phrase became a jest at Karen's expense. "Would you like some death brine with your supper?" And then became an article of faith. Everyone knew that fish salted in barrels was dangerous. Everyone knew that proper people ate fresh meat, not pickled peasant food. Dr. Osgood Farrow, the town's only physician, added his professional weight to the warnings. Dr. Farrow was an Easterner who had come to Pike Falls to escape debts and scandal in Boston, though he told people it was for the fresh air. He knew very little about fish and even less about preservation, but he knew how to sound authoritative. "Improperly preserved fish can harbor toxins that attack the nervous system," he declared at a town council meeting. "Paralysis, convulsions, death. I have read the literature. The risks are substantial. I would strongly advise against consuming anything from Mrs. Lindquist's operation." The council, led by Mayor Osmond Rask, a cautious man who owed his position largely to Kane's financial support, passed a resolution discouraging the purchase of fish products preserved by unconventional methods. It was not a ban, exactly, but it carried the weight of official disapproval. Karen heard about the resolution from Haskell, the land agent, who had softened toward her over the years and sometimes stopped by her cabin with news from town. "They're afraid of what they don't understand," he said, accepting a cup of coffee on her porch. And Cain is afraid of what he does understand: competition. "Let them be afraid," Karen said. "The fish do not care about resolutions." She continued her work. She continued to fill her barrels. She continued to eat fish that, according to the official wisdom of Pike Falls, should have killed her years ago. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now back to the story. The autumn of 1886 brought warnings that Karen recognized and Pike Falls ignored. The geese flew south in September, 3 weeks early. The muskrats built their lodges thick and high along the riverbank. The black bears that sometimes wandered down from the north woods were fat beyond reason, their coats glossy and dense. And the old Ojibwe man, who sometimes traded with Karen, a man named Makwa, which meant bear, told her in his broken English that the winter coming would be one for the stories. "Much snow," he said, holding his hand high above his head. "Much cold. River freeze early. Stay long." Karen doubled her salt purchase in October. She caught and preserved fish at a furious pace, working from dark to dark, filling her last 3 barrels in the first week of November. She stockpiled firewood until the pile reached the eaves of her cabin. She laid in flour and potatoes and dried beans, provisions to supplement the fish. She prepared as if her life depended on it. In Pike Falls, the approach of winter inspired no such urgency. The logging camps had operated through hard winters before. The butcher's shop had always been stocked. The supply wagons had always come through, bringing whatever the town needed from the railheads to the south. Why should this year be any different? The cold came on November 8th. It arrived not gradually, as winter usually did, but all at once, a wall of Arctic air that rolled down from Canada and dropped the temperature 50 degrees in a single night. The Crow Wing River, which had been flowing freely at sunset, was frozen solid by the following dawn. The ice was 6 inches thick by noon, a foot thick by nightfall, and it continued to thicken until it would bear the weight of a loaded freight wagon without creaking. The freeze caught everyone by surprise. The cattle drives that were supposed to arrive that week turned back, unable to cross the rivers that had suddenly become impassable. The supply wagons that were supposed to deliver provisions from the south bogged down in snow that fell for 4 days without ceasing, burying the roads under drifts that no team could pull through. Pike Falls, which had entered November confident and connected, found itself isolated and alone. Everett Kane's butcher shop, which had been modestly stocked in anticipation of the usual winter shipments, began to empty at an alarming rate. The logging camps, which employed hundreds of men who needed thousands of calories daily, sent their buyers to town with cash and found little to buy. Kane rationed what he had, raising prices, stretching supplies, but the math was merciless. There was simply not enough meat to last the winter. By December, the situation had become desperate. The last beef was sold on the 1st of the month. The pork followed. Kane began selling parts he had always discarded: heads, hooves, organs, at prices that would have seemed obscene in better times. He sold bones for soup stock. He sold fat for tallow. He sold everything that had even a memory of having once been meat, and still it was not enough. The logging camps shut down in mid-December. Without adequate food, the men could not work. Without work, they could not earn. Without earnings, they could not buy what little food remained. The camps emptied as men scattered, some heading south on foot to seek provisions, others hunkering down in their bunkhouses to wait out the winter on reduced rations. In Pike Falls itself, families began to suffer. The children grew thin first, as children always did. The elderly stopped eating, claiming they were not hungry, knowing that every mouthful they took was a mouthful their grandchildren did not have. The town that had been so confident in October was hollowed out by Christmas, its people surviving on what scraps they could find, praying for a thaw that would not come. And through it all, the woman on the river sat in her warm cabin, eating salted fish from barrels that held enough to last 3 winters. Karen did not wait for them to come to her. On Christmas morning, she loaded Birch's sledge with 5 barrels of salted fish, nearly 100 pounds, and drove into Pike Falls. The sledge runners hissed on the frozen snow. The cold bit at every inch of exposed skin. Birch's breath plumed white in the still air, freezing on her whiskers, but the mare was strong and willing, and they made the 2 miles in good time. Karen set up outside Kane's closed butcher shop. At the very spot where the man had built his business on meat, she was now replacing with fish. She opened the first barrel, letting the sharp, clean smell of salt brine rise into the frozen air. "No charge," she called to the first curious faces that appeared. "Take what you need, I have more." They came hesitantly at first, the memory of poisoned fish still fresh in their minds. A young mother with 2 children clinging to her skirts approached the barrel and stared at the pale flesh within, her face showing the war between hunger and fear. "It is safe," Karen said gently. "I have eaten this fish for 3 years. I have never been sick, neither will you." The woman reached into the barrel and took a piece. She sniffed it, touched it to her tongue, and her eyes widened. It tasted of salt and fish and survival, nothing more. She took another piece and another, filling her apron, weeping as she did so. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." The line formed within the hour. Half of Pike Falls stood in the frozen street, waiting to receive what Everett Kane had told them would kill them. Karen distributed her stores with calm efficiency, ensuring that families with children received first priority, that the elderly were not forgotten, that no one left empty-handed. She returned the next day with more, and the next, and the next. For 7 weeks, Karen Lindquist fed Pike Falls from her barrels of poison fish. She made the journey into town every 3 days, loading her sledge with 100 pounds of salted protein, distributing it to whoever came. She taught the women how to soak the fish overnight to remove excess salt, how to cook it in 100 different ways, fried in a pan, simmered in a stew, baked with potatoes, flaked into a creamy sauce. She showed them that the flesh they had feared was not death in a barrel, but life itself, preserved against exactly this moment. Everett Kane watched from his empty shop. For the first 2 weeks, he refused to acknowledge what was happening. Then, when his own family began to show signs of hunger, his pride crumbled. He appeared at Karen's table on a January morning, his florid face pale and drawn, his blood-stained apron hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight. "Mrs. Lindquist," he said. The words seemed to cost him something precious. "I find myself in need." Karen looked at him, the man who had called her fish poison, who had warned the town against her, who had used his influence to turn her into a pariah. "Everyone finds themselves in need eventually, Mr. Kane," she said. "That is why we prepare." She handed him a portion of fish, wrapped in cloth. "Soak it overnight. The salt draws out when you do. Your family will eat well tomorrow." Kane took the fish. For a moment, he seemed about to speak, to apologize perhaps, or to thank her, but the words would not come. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away. Dr. Farrow was among the last to come. He approached the table in late January, after weeks of watching his patients recover their strength on a diet of fish he had called toxic. His professional pride was in tatters. His warnings had been worse than wrong. They had been dangerous, encouraging people to avoid the very food that might have saved them sooner. "Mrs. Lindquist," he said, "I owe you an apology. I spoke from ignorance. What I called poison has proved to be quite the opposite." "You spoke from what you believed," Karen said. "Belief is not knowledge. Now you know." The thaw came in March. The river cracked and groaned and finally surrendered its ice to the strengthening sun. The roads opened. The supply wagons arrived, carrying flour and coffee and all the provisions that Pike Falls had been denied. Normalcy returned, or something like it. But the town that emerged from the winter was not the same town that had entered it. A gathering was held at the church on the first Sunday of April. The pews were packed, not with worshipers, but with witnesses. They had come to acknowledge what had happened and to honor the woman who had made their survival possible. Mayor Rask spoke first, his voice thick with a shame that no amount of rhetoric could disguise. Last autumn, this council passed a resolution discouraging the consumption of Mrs. Lindquist's fish. We called her methods unconventional. We called her product unsafe. He paused, gathering himself. We were wrong, not merely mistaken, but dangerously, culpably wrong. Our ignorance nearly became our epitaph. He turned to Karen, who sat in her usual place, a pew near the back, close to the door. "Mrs. Lindquist, you fed this town when we had nothing. You shared your stores when we had given you every reason to let us starve. You answered our contempt with compassion. I speak for the council, and I hope for this community when I say we are sorry and we are grateful." Everett Kane rose next. The butcher who had built his business on meat and his reputation on mocking fish stood before the assembly with the bearing of a man whose foundations had been shattered. "I told you her fish was poison," he said, his voice rough. "I told you it would kill you. I said it because I believed it, and I believed it because I wanted to believe it. A woman preserving fish threatened my trade. So I made her an enemy, and I convinced you to do the same." He stopped. His hands, those blood-stained hands, trembled at his sides. "My children ate her fish. My wife ate her fish. I ate her fish. We are alive because of her fish. Everything I said was a lie born of greed, and I will carry that knowledge for the rest of my days." Dr. Farrow's apology was clinical but sincere. He admitted that he had spoken beyond his expertise, that he had allowed professional vanity to cloud his judgment, that he had nearly caused deaths by discouraging consumption of perfectly wholesome food. When the confessions were complete, Karen stood. The church fell silent. "In my country," she said, her English still carrying the cadence of Swedish, "we have salted fish for 1,000 years. My mother learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, back and back to times no one remembers. It is not a secret. It is not a mystery. It is simply knowledge, knowledge that I was willing to share from the first day I arrived, if anyone had cared to learn." She looked around the room. "You did not want to learn. You wanted to mock. That is your way, perhaps, to laugh at what you do not understand. I do not hold it against you. Mockery is the tribute that ignorance pays to knowledge. What matters now is what we do with the lesson." She paused. "The river is full of fish. There is no reason for this town ever to go hungry again, if you are willing to do the work. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The salt is not expensive. The method is not difficult. The fish are free for the catching. Next winter, when the river freezes, let us all have barrels in our cellars. Thank you for watching this story about Karen Lindquist and the salted fish of Pike Falls. When we dismiss the old ways, we risk losing the very knowledge that might save us. If this story reminded you that preservation is not paranoia, but prudence, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called your preparations unnecessary until the day they weren't? That summer, Karen taught 17 families the art of fish preservation. She showed them how to clean and split the catch, how to measure the salt, how to pack the barrels, how to store them properly. She explained the signs of good preservation and the signs of spoilage. She gave them the knowledge her mother had given her, freely and without reservation. Everett Kane was among her students. He came to her cabin one June afternoon, hat in hand, and asked if she would teach him a skill that might supplement his butchering. She agreed and discovered that the man who had been her enemy was actually a quick learner when his pride was not in the way. By autumn, Kane's shop offered salted fish alongside beef and pork. The first butcher in Minnesota, he boasted, to recognize that protein came from rivers as well as pastures. Mayor Rask proposed a resolution recognizing Karen Lindquist for her service to the community. She declined the honor, saying that recognition was meaningless and knowledge was what mattered. The council instead established a fund to purchase salt in bulk each year, making it available at cost to any family that wished to preserve fish for winter. They called it the Lindquist Fund, and Karen did not object to that. The phrase "filling the barrels" entered the vocabulary of Pike Falls and spread to surrounding settlements. It meant preparing for hardship during times of ease, trusting in old methods that had proven themselves over centuries. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned the hard way. Karen Lindquist lived on her riverbank claim for another 31 years, fishing and salting and teaching until her hands could no longer grip the knife. She passed in the spring of 1917 at the age of 72 and was buried beside Anders in the small cemetery overlooking the Crow Wing River. Birch had preceded her by 18 years, buried near the fish house where the mayor had so often waited while her mistress worked. The fish house still stands. The families who maintain it follow Karen's methods precisely, salting their catch each summer, filling their barrels each autumn, entering each winter with the security of knowing that the river's bounty has been preserved against whatever darkness the season delivers. Above the door, carved in a hand that knew more about fish than about carpentry, is an inscription that Karen placed there in the spring of 1887. The river provides, the salt remembers. Her mother, who had carried the knowledge from the shores of Sweden, would have recognized every word.